The night is deep, my friends. Can you feel the chill creeping through your bones? I am Damien Tao. Welcome back to Netherwave Radio, where the veil between worlds grows thin and the forgotten stories of the East find their voice in the darkness. Tonight, I bring you two tales from the countryside places where the old ways still hold power. These stories come from a time when people understood that death is not an ending, but a transition. A doorway, and sometimes the door swings both ways. Our first story takes place at a funeral, but this is no ordinary Western funeral with quiet mourning and polite tears. In rural China, when someone dies, the entire village comes alive with ritual. There are ceremonies that must be performed, ancient rites that city folk have long forgotten. This particular ritual is called a Nian Kui, a cleansing ceremony. You see, the Chinese believe that when a person dies, their essence lingers in the house like a fog. This presence, this qi, must be swept away, or the living will be pulled into darkness. The boy who witnessed this ritual was called Little Gang. He was only 10 years old when his great-aunt passed away at the age of 80. They called her old Auntie Gu a woman who had lived so long that she'd begun to forget the difference between this world and the next. Old Auntie Gu had a habit, you see. Every day she would sit in her rocking chair in the corner of the courtyard. She'd rock there for hours, staring at nothing, her mind wandering through memories that were half dream, half ghost. The chair would creak back and forth. Back and forth. On the night of the burial, Little Gang's parents took him to old Auntie Gu's house. The whole village had gathered. It was custom to help with funerals. In the countryside, death is not private. It belongs to everyone. Little Gang's father didn't want to leave him home alone, not on a night like this. So the boy came along, wide-eyed and nervous, watching the adults prepare for something he didn't quite understand. The funeral had been lively during the day, what Westerners might call a celebration of life, though that is not quite accurate. It was more like appeasing the dead, making sure they left content without lingering grudges. But as night fell, the mood changed. The chatter died down. It was time for Nian Kui, the cleansing ritual. This was the serious part, the dangerous part. For this ritual, they needed specific items. First, a rooster with a bright red comb. The redder the better. Red, you understand, is the color of life force in Chinese belief. It frightens ghosts and evil spirits, but it also attracts them. Second, heavy iron chains, the kind that drag and scrape against stone, making a sound that sets your teeth on edge. Ghosts hate that sound. It reminds them of being bound to this world. Third, willow branches. In Chinese folklore, willow trees grow between worlds. Their branches can sweep away lingering spirits like dust from a floor, but they must be cut at the right time, under the right moon. And finally, a butcher's knife. Large, heavy, with a blade that had tasted blood many times before. The knife wasn't for protection, it was for opening the veil. 5 men were chosen to perform the ritual. They had to be strong, healthy, and preferably with loud, forceful voices. Among them was Uncle Wang, a friend of Little Gang's father, a burly man with rough hands and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles. Before the ritual began, one of the men took the butcher's knife and made a careful cut on the rooster's neck. Not deep, they didn't want to kill it yet. Just deep enough to let the blood start flowing. The rooster began to struggle violently, its cries piercing the night air. Blood dripped, drop by drop, onto the stone courtyard floor, each spot darkening the dust. The 5 men divided their tasks. Uncle Wang held the bleeding rooster at the front of the procession. Behind him, 2 men dragged the heavy iron chains across the ground. The sound was terrible, a grinding, scraping shriek that made Little Gang cover his ears. The other two men wielded the willow branches, whipping them through the air in wide, sweeping motions. They moved like they were fighting invisible enemies, striking at things only they could sense. The procession began to circle the house. They moved slowly, methodically, covering every corner. The rooster's blood marked their path, a trail of crimson droplets glistening in the lamplight. Little Gang watched from the doorway, his heart pounding. The sounds merged together, the scraping chains, the rooster's desperate cries, the whistle of willow branches cutting air. It sounded like a summoning, like they were calling to something. At first, everything went smoothly. The procession moved through the main hall, past the bedrooms, through the kitchen. The rooster struggled and squawked, but nothing unusual happened. The men's voices grew confident as they chanted old words, prayers, or curses. Little Gang couldn't tell the difference. But then they reached the courtyard corner, the place where old Auntie Goo had spent every afternoon, the place where her rocking chair still sat, empty and waiting. The moment the procession approached that corner, the rooster let out a sound that stopped everyone cold. It wasn't a crow or a squawk, it was a shriek. A human shriek, like someone being strangled. Uncle Wong froze, his face draining of color. His grip loosened in shock, and the rooster fell from his hands, hitting the ground with a wet thud. The bird thrashed on the stones, its wings beating frantically against the ground. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed through the courtyard like a drum, or a heartbeat. And then something even stranger happened. From beneath a nearby table, old Auntie Goo's dog, a scruffy yellow village dog that had been silent all evening, suddenly burst forth barking furiously. But the dog wasn't barking at the rooster. It was barking at the rocking chair, at the empty space where old Auntie Goo used to sit. The dog barked like it could see someone there, someone the humans couldn't see. The dog's fur stood on end, every hair electrified with terror. Its back legs shook uncontrollably. It wanted to run but couldn't. It was frozen by whatever it was seeing. Within seconds, the barking spread. From outside the courtyard, other dogs began to howl. First one, then another, then a chorus of them. All the village dogs were responding to something. Within moments, 5 or 6 stray dogs rushed into the courtyard from the night. Big ones, small ones, all different breeds. But they all did the same thing, surrounded that corner and barked at the empty rocking chair. They circled it, staying exactly 1 foot away, like there was an invisible barrier they couldn't cross. They paced and whined and barked, the way dogs do when they've encountered something that violates the natural order. The rooster on the ground was still struggling, but its movements were growing weaker. More blood spread across the stones, forming a dark pool that reflected the lamplight like a black mirror. The wings beat slower and slower, each movement more labored than the last. The rooster was dying, but it wouldn't go quietly. It fought death as if something was holding onto it, keeping it conscious. The villagers stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Time seemed to stretch. 10 seconds felt like minutes. Everyone's breath caught in their throats, waiting for something. Finally, someone broke from the trance. Several men moved forward to chase the dogs away, their movements mechanical, like they were sleepwalking. But before they could reach the dogs, the rocking chair began to move by itself, with no one in it, no wind, no explanation, just rocking back and forth, back and forth. Creak. Creak, creak. The sound cut through the silence like a knife. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone was sitting there calmly rocking, unconcerned by all the chaos around them. A yellow oil lamp hung nearby, its flame flickering. As the chair rocked, the light and shadow on it alternated bright, dark like the chair was breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Everyone saw it. There was no denying what was happening. The dogs barked even louder, their voices cracking with panic. Several men tried to advance to drive the dogs away, but their feet moved slowly, reluctantly. They kicked at the dogs half-heartedly, but the animals paid no attention. Their entire focus remained on that chair. The rooster gave one final long cry, a sound more mournful than terrified. Then it stopped moving entirely. Its body went limp, and the last of its blood leaked out onto the stones. The blood spread further, forming an irregular shape on the courtyard floor, like a map of something, or a character written in a language no one could read. In the dim light, it looked black-red, the color of old wine or rust. The rocking chair continued its motion. Creak, creak. Creak, getting louder with each swing, as if whatever was sitting in it was growing heavier, more present, more real. Then suddenly, old Auntie Goo's son, Master Ding, a man in his 50s with graying hair, fell to his knees on the bloody stones. His voice cracked as he cried out into the darkness. "Mother," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Mother, please, whatever it is you can't let go of, tell me in a dream. You've passed on now. You must go. Don't frighten the living anymore." His words hung in the air. For 5 long seconds, nothing happened. The chair kept rocking, the dogs kept barking, the blood kept spreading. Then slowly, so slowly, it was almost imperceptible at first, the dogs' barking began to quiet. Not all at once, but one by one. Like candles being snuffed out, their voices dropped from frantic barking to whimpering, then to silence. Each dog seemed to suddenly remember where it was, and that it didn't belong there. One by one, they walked away, not running, not being chased, just leaving, as if released from an invisible command. They padded out of the courtyard on silent paws and disappeared into the black night beyond. The courtyard fell into a terrible silence. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the gradually slowing creak of the rocking chair, getting softer and softer. The air felt thick, heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. The villagers stood motionless, watching the chair gradually come to rest. The light from the oil lamp steadied, and the shifting shadows stopped their breathing motion. Master Ding's wife, Aunt Zhang, a sturdy woman with work-hardened hands, moved with sudden purpose. She disappeared into the house and returned moments later carrying a brass brazier. In Chinese tradition, you see, the dead need money in the afterlife, just as the living need it here. But they can't use our currency. They need ghost money paper bills printed with enormous denominations, along with paper replicas of gold and silver ingots. Aunt Zhang placed the brazier directly in front of the rocking chair, as if offering it to someone sitting there. She struck a match. The sulfur flared bright blue-white in the darkness, and touched it to the paper. The paper caught immediately. Flames rose from the brazier, orange and hungry, consuming the spirit money. Smoke spiraled upward, carrying the burned offerings to the other world, or so the belief goes. As the fire burned, Aunt Zhang knelt and began to speak in a low, urgent voice. "Mother-in-law, please accept these offerings. Cross over peacefully. Don't remain here. Your suffering is over now." The paper burned fast, turning to ash that floated upward like souls escaping. The courtyard filled with the acrid smell of burning paper, and incense, a smell that anyone who has attended a Chinese funeral knows intimately. They burned everything: stacks of yellow paper, silver and gold ingots, even paper clothes and paper shoes, so old Auntie Goo wouldn't go cold or barefoot in the afterlife. The fire illuminated the courtyard with dancing orange light that made everyone's faces look hollow, skull-like. As the last pieces of paper curled and blackened, the night grew quiet in a different way. Not the oppressive silence from before. This was softer, almost peaceful. The tension that had gripped the courtyard began to ease, like a fist slowly unclenching. People began to breathe again, to move, to whisper to each other in hushed tones. The ritual, it seemed, was complete, whatever presence had been there. was there no longer. Little Gang, watching from the doorway, didn't understand everything he'd seen, but he understood enough to know that he'd witnessed something impossible. Something that would trouble his dreams for years to come. After that night, the family cleaned the courtyard thoroughly. They burned more offerings at regular intervals. But most importantly, they took that rocking chair and dismantled it, smashed it to pieces and burned every splinter. Some objects you see hold memory. They absorb the essence of those who use them day after day, year after year. And when that person dies, sometimes a part of them remains, attached to the object like a ghost to a house. But our night's journey isn't over yet, my friends. That was merely the first tale, the second story. The second story is different, more personal, more invasive. It is about what happens when the boundary between human and spirit becomes too thin. When something from the other side decides it needs a body. This tale involves something the Chinese call Xianjia, literally immortal family. These are animal spirits that have cultivated themselves through centuries of practice, attempting to achieve enlightenment. In the West, you might call them demons or familiars. But that is not quite right. They're not evil by nature, just different. Existing between the animal and the divine, neither fully one nor the other. And when they need something from the world of humans, they must ask in the only way they can. Little Gang was still young when this second incident occurred, perhaps 11 or 12. Old enough to remember clearly, young enough to be terrified. It involved his grandmother on his mother's side, a woman in her 70s who everyone called Nai Nai. Nai Nai was a vigorous old woman despite her age. She lived alone in a small house on the edge of the village, refusing all offers to move in with family. "I like my independence," she'd say. "When you're my age, you've earned the right to live as you please." One autumn evening, Nai Nai needed to visit a neighbor on the other side of the village. The shortest route required crossing an old railroad track, a single line that hadn't seen regular service in years. Occasionally a freight train would rumble through, but rarely after dark. Nai Nai walked across the tracks just as the sun was setting, the sky turning that deep purple red that the Chinese consider ominous, the color of blood mixed with bruises. She noticed nothing unusual at the time. The crossing was empty, quiet, ordinary. But when she returned home an hour later after full dark had fallen, something was different. She felt strange, dizzy, unbalanced, like the ground beneath her feet wasn't quite solid. She attributed it to age and fatigue and went to bed early. The next morning, when Nai Nai tried to stand, her family learned the truth. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. Her body moved, but not like a human body should move. It twisted and writhed, her spine bending in ways that should have broken bones. She moved across the floor in a sinuous, slithering motion, like a snake. Little Gang's mother arrived to find Nai Nai on the floor, her arms and legs bent at strange angles, her head weaving back and forth like a cobra preparing to strike. The old woman's eyes were open, but they didn't look human anymore. They had a distant, glassy quality like a reptile's eyes. When Little Gang's mother tried to help her stand, Nai Nai hissed, an actual hissing sound, air forced between teeth in that distinctive reptilian warning. Her tongue flickered out, testing the air. This was possession, but not possession by a ghost or demon. This was something older, something that had once been an animal and had spent lifetimes trying to become more. This was a Xianjia, and it had needs. They needed help, and quickly in rural China, when modern medicine fails, you turn to those who understand the old ways. They called for Master Liu, an elderly man who dealt with such matters. Not quite a priest, not quite a doctor, something in between. Master Liu arrived with his tools, a copper coin sword, bundles of herbs, strips of yellow paper covered in red characters. He took one look at Nai Nai writhing on the floor and nodded slowly. "Ah," he said quietly, "a snake spirit. And not a young one." He explained that when Nai Nai crossed the railroad tracks at twilight, that liminal time between day and night, she had passed through a threshold, and something had been waiting there, desperate and dying. It had seized the opportunity to enter the world of the living through her. It doesn't want to harm her, Master Lu said, arranging his tools. It just wants something. We need to find out what, and give it if we can. Otherwise, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Master Liu lit 3 sticks of incense and placed them in a small bronze holder. The smoke rose straight up in thin lines, not wavering despite the breeze from the open door. When smoke rises straight, he murmured, "The spirits are listening. They're close." He approached Nai Nai carefully, the way you'd approach a wild animal. She was curled on the floor now, her body compressed into an impossibly small space, like a snake coiled in its burrow. Her breathing had changed slow, deliberate, with long pauses between each breath. Master Liu knelt beside her and began to speak, not to Nai Nai, but to whatever was inside her. His voice was respectful, even gentle. "Old one," he said in the local dialect, "I know you've suffered. I know you've waited a long time. We're here to listen." For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then Nai Nai's head began to rise, not like a person lifting their head, but like a snake raising itself from the ground. Her neck extended impossibly long, vertebrae visible beneath the skin. When she opened her mouth, the voice that emerged was not hers. It was layered, Nai Nai's elderly rasp underneath, but over it something else. Something that sounded like wind through bamboo, like scales sliding over rock. "I was murdered," the voice said, each word coming slowly, as if speech was difficult. 200 years, I cultivated, became almost human. They killed me on the tracks. My grave, desecrated I have nothing. The story came out in fragments. This spirit had once been a snake, a common water snake from the nearby river, but it had lived long enough, and in the right places, to begin the impossible journey toward enlightenment. In Chinese folklore, you see, animals can cultivate themselves through meditation and discipline just as humans can. For 2 centuries, this snake had practiced. It had learned to take human form not perfectly, but well enough. It walked on 2 legs, spoke with a human voice, tried to live among people. And then, decades ago, it had been discovered and killed. Beaten to death by villagers who saw only a monster, not a being trying desperately to transcend its nature. They had buried the body beside the railroad tracks, a deliberate insult. In Chinese belief, being buried near a railway means your spirit will be constantly disturbed, unable to rest. The vibrations of passing trains shake your bones. The noise drives you mad. And now, the voice continued through Nai Nai's mouth. The tracks, expansion, they dig, they disturb my bones. I have nowhere to rest. I need offerings, ghost money, incense. A proper burial. Master Liu nodded slowly, understanding. This wasn't malice, it was desperation. The spirit hadn't chosen Nai Nai out of cruelty. She had simply been there at the right moment, when the spirit was at its most vulnerable and desperate. "We can provide what you need," Master Liu said carefully, "but you must release this woman. She is innocent. She didn't disturb your grave. She didn't even know it was there. Take your offerings and go in peace." There was a long, tense silence. Nai Nai's body remained coiled and tense. Little Gang, watching from behind his mother, held his breath. The incense smoke continued to rise in those impossible straight lines. Finally, the layered voice spoke again. 3 days burn, offerings at the tracks bury my bones properly. Then I go. I promise. Master Liu agreed immediately. 3 days, you have my word, but you must not harm this woman. Do you understand? Return her body to her unharmed. I never wanted to harm, only to be heard. And with those words, Nai Nai's body suddenly went limp, collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. Her neck returned to its normal length, her limbs unfolded, her eyes rolled forward and focused. Where Where am I? Nai-Nai's voice was her own again, confused, weak, but human. She remembered nothing. The possession had been complete. Her consciousness had been pushed aside while the spirit used her body like a borrowed coat. They helped her to bed. She was weak, trembling, her muscles aching from the unnatural positions they'd been forced into, but she was alive and whole. Master Lu checked her pulse, looked at her tongue, examined her eyes. "She'll recover," he said. "But we must keep our promise." That afternoon, they sent someone to the railroad tracks to investigate. Sure enough, railroad expansion work had begun the previous week. The workers had excavated along the line, and in doing so, they'd unearthed an old grave unmarked, forgotten, containing bones that were unmistakably non-human. Too long. Too many ribs, the skull slightly wrong. The bones were long and serpentine, but there were also fragments of human-like bones mixed in an impossible hybrid, the physical evidence of a creature caught between two forms. The construction workers had simply tossed them aside like trash, not understanding what they'd found. For 3 days, the family prepared offerings. They purchased stacks of ghost money, those oversized bills printed with astronomical denominations. 10 million yuan notes, 100 million yuan notes, all destined for flames. In the afterlife economy, inflation is extreme. They also prepared paper offerings of clothing, shoes, a house, even servants, everything the spirit might need in the next world. In Chinese tradition, burning paper representations sends the real thing to the deceased. It is a kind of spiritual alchemy. On the third night, they gathered at the railroad tracks at twilight, that same liminal hour when Nai-Nai had first crossed. Master Lu led the ceremony, with Little Gang's family and several villagers in attendance. The sky was the same purple. Red it had been 3 days earlier. They had collected all the scattered bones, every fragment they could find, and placed them in a proper wooden box. Master Lu had written protective characters on the box in cinnabar ink, sealing whatever remained of the spirit his physical form. They dug a new grave a proper distance from the tracks, in a spot Master Lu had chosen using his compass and almanac, a place where the qi flowed correctly, where the spirit could rest without disturbance. The grave faced south as tradition demanded. The earth smelled of rain and iron. They lowered the box into the earth with respectful hands. Then, before filling the grave, they placed offerings around it: fruit, rice, tea, incense. Not the offerings for a human, but not quite the offerings for an animal either. Something in between, acknowledging the spirit is unique nature. Master Lu lit the first stack of ghost money. The flames rose high and fierce, consuming the paper with eager hunger. The smoke spiraled upward, carrying the offerings to whatever realm the spirit now inhabited. They burned everything they'd prepared: money, clothes, the paper house, all of it. The fire lit up the railroad crossing with dancing orange light. Ash floated up like reverse snow, black flakes ascending toward the purple sky. As the last pieces of paper curled and blackened, a wind rose sudden and localized, swirling only around the gravesite. It carried a scent that none of them could quite identify. Not unpleasant, but strange, like river water and old stone and something green and ancient. Little Gang felt something then, a sensation like being watched by something that meant no harm. A presence passing by, pausing to acknowledge their respect, and then moving on. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen. They filled in the grave and marked it with a simple stone. No name. The spirit had lost its name long ago, but Master Liu carved a single character: sentient, immortal, a recognition of what the spirit had tried to become. As they walked back to the village, the railroad crossing behind them fell into shadow. The gravesite disappeared into darkness. But there was no sense of menace now, only peace. Whatever had been restless and angry was restless and angry no longer. That night, Nai-Nai slept without nightmares. The next morning, she was able to walk normally. Her body returned to its natural movements. The strange glassiness left her eyes. She was herself again, completely and entirely. But she never crossed those railroad tracks again. Even years later, even in full daylight, she would take the long way around, Some boundaries once crossed at the wrong time leave marks that never quite fade. Little Gang asked Master Liu later why the snake spirit had been so desperate, so aggressive in taking control of Nai Nai's body. The old man's answer was simple. Imagine being murdered after 200 years of effort. Imagine your grave being destroyed, your bones scattered like garbage. Wouldn't you be desperate too? In the West, I tell you now, my friends, there is this idea that spirits are inherently evil, that possession is demonic, that anything non-human is automatically malevolent. But here in the East, we understand differently. We know that most spirits are simply trying to survive, just like the living. The snake spirit could have harmed Nai Nai. It could have kept her body, used it until it wore out, then moved to another. But it didn't. It asked for what it needed, made a promise, and kept that promise. There is honor in that. Even in the world of spirits, there is honor. Master Liu explained that snake spirits, particularly old ones, are known for their integrity. If they give their word, they keep it. It is part of their cultivation toward immortality. Breaking a promise would set them back decades, even centuries. So when the snake spirit promised to leave Nai Nai unharmed and never return, it meant it. In Chinese folklore, snakes are particularly tragic figures when they attempt cultivation. You see, in the hierarchy of creatures that can achieve enlightenment, snakes start at a severe disadvantage. Foxes have it easier, they're clever by nature. Weasels are crafty, but snakes are cold-blooded. Literally and metaphorically, they must work harder than any other creature. To cultivate successfully, a snake must spend hundreds of years in meditation, learning to generate internal warmth, learning to override its hunting instincts, learning to think beyond the next meal or the next season. Each decade of successful cultivation is a victory against its own nature. And if such a creature manages to reach the point of taking human form, even imperfectly, that represents centuries of absolute dedication, which is why being murdered at that point is not just death, but the destruction of lifetimes of effort. The rage and grief of such a loss is difficult for humans to comprehend. But this particular snake spirit hadn't let that rage turn it evil. It had held onto its cultivation, its progress toward enlightenment. Even in death, even scattered and desperate, it had maintained enough control to negotiate rather than simply destroy. That, Master Liu said, indicated a very high level of cultivation indeed. After that incident, the family took precautions. They hung protective charms around Nai Nai's house, Bagua mirrors to deflect negative energy, strings of copper coins to ward off spirits with ill intent, strips of red cloth over every door and window. Red, as I've mentioned, is protective. It is the color of life force, yang energy. Most spirits avoid it. They placed a small sword made of copper coins strung together above her bed. In Chinese belief, old copper coins absorb yang energy from circulation from being handled by the living, used in commerce, passing through countless transactions of daily life. String them together in the right pattern, and they become a weapon against the supernatural. For weeks afterward, Nai Nai felt phantom sensations, the memory of being twisted and bent, of moving in ways humans shouldn't move. She'd wake in the night convinced she was still possessed, her heart racing. But gradually, the memories faded. The body forgets what the mind refuses to accept. Little Gang's mother told him the story in detail when he was older, filling in the parts he'd been too young to witness or understand. She explained that possession isn't always malevolent. Sometimes it is simply communication. The spirit world and human world exist side by side, occasionally overlapping, occasionally needing to interact. The spirit didn't want to hurt Nai Nai, his mother said. It just had no other way to speak. Imagine being invisible and inaudible, desperately needing help, with no way to ask except to borrow someone's body for a few hours. Wouldn't you do the same? The question haunted little Gang. Would he, in desperation facing oblivion, would he invade another being just to survive? He didn't know the answer. He hoped he'd never need to find out. Years later, when the railroad finally completed its expansion, workers reported strange sounds near that section of track. Not frightening sounds, just odd. Like wind through bamboo, or water flowing over stones, even when there was no bamboo and no water nearby. The sound of something ancient and persistent, living on in memory. But nothing harmful happened. No more possessions, no more disturbances. The offerings had been accepted, the contract honored. The snake spirit had kept its promise, just as Master Liu said it would. Nai Nai lived for another 15 years after that incident, eventually passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. The family always wondered if the snake spirit had somehow blessed her for her role willingly or not, in helping it find peace. Certainly, she never had another day's illness that couldn't be explained by natural age. At her funeral, someone no one ever discovered who left an unusual offering on her altar. Among the normal flowers and fruit was a smooth river stone, perfectly oval, with a pattern in the mineral veins that looked remarkably like a snake in mid-coil. The family kept it. They keep it still. Little Gang, now grown, eventually moved to the city, but he returns to the village occasionally, and when he does, he always walks past that railroad crossing. The grave with the single character is still there, now weathered and covered with moss. Someone, perhaps descendants of Master Liu, perhaps others who know the story, still leaves offerings there sometimes. Fresh flowers, sticks of incense burned down to ash. The railroad still runs, of course. Trains pass through several times a day, their whistles echoing across the fields. But people in the village say that dogs no longer bark when trains pass that particular section of track. They're quiet, respectful, as if they sense something there that deserves courtesy. These stories I'm telling you, my friends, they're not cautionary tales about avoiding spirits. They're not warnings to fear the supernatural. They're something more subtle than that. They're reminders that the world is more complex than we usually admit. In the West, you have this binary thinking, alive or dead, human or not, good or evil. But here in the East, we've always understood that existence is more of a spectrum. There are beings in various stages of transformation, creatures becoming spirits, spirits becoming immortals. Humans becoming ghosts. The boundaries are permeable, and if the boundaries are permeable, then perhaps what seems frightening is simply unfamiliar. The snake spirit didn't want to harm, it wanted recognition. Old Auntie Goo's ghost didn't want to terrorize, it wanted acknowledgement before departing. These aren't monsters. They're beings caught between states, needing help from the living to complete their transitions. Of course, not all spirits are benevolent. Not all possessions are simple communication. Master Liu was careful to emphasize this. There are genuine dangers in the spirit world, entities that have become so twisted by rage or pain that they've lost all connection to compassion. These must be defended against, driven out, sometimes destroyed. But the key is discernment. Don't assume every supernatural encounter is hostile. Don't assume every spirit is a demon. Sometimes a possessed person is actually a messenger. Sometimes a haunting is actually a plea for help. The wise person learns to tell the difference. This is why, in traditional Chinese villages, there are still people like Master Liu, individuals who understand the old protocols, who speak the language of spirits, who can negotiate between worlds. They're not exorcists in the Western sense. They're more like mediators, diplomats between the living and the dead. These mediators have complex relationships with the spirit world. They offer respect and receive respect. They make deals on behalf of humans and honor those deals scrupulously. Their word must be absolutely trustworthy, or the system breaks down and chaos follows. Little Gang asked Master Liu once how he knew which spirits could be negotiated with, and which needed to be driven away. The old man's answer was simple but profound. I listened listen, the desperate sound different from the malicious. Pain sounds different from cruelty. If you listen with your heart instead of your fear, you can usually tell. This listening this deep, careful attention to the quality of a haunting or possession is a skill that takes decades to develop. Master Liu had been doing this work since his 20s. He'd seen countless cases, learned to recognize patterns, developed instincts about when to be gentle and when to be forceful. He told little gang stories of other possessions he'd witnessed. Some were terrifying demons that had to be fought and bound. But most were like the snake spirit, desperate, confused, seeking something simple that humans could provide. A burial, a message delivered, a wrong acknowledged, a promise kept. Spirits who ask for something reasonable, Master Liu explained, are the ones who still have some connection to order, to righteousness. They remember being alive. They remember fairness. Those are safe to negotiate with. It is the ones who demand nothing, who just want to hurt. Those are the true dangers. Fortunately, Master Liu said, the truly malicious spirits are rare. Most entities, having died, simply want what they wanted when alive, dignity, remembrance, to matter to someone. The rituals of ancestor worship serve this purpose. They assure the dead that they haven't been forgotten. This is why, in Chinese culture, forgetting the dead is considered a grave offense. Not just disrespectful, dangerous. Forgotten dead become hungry ghosts, wandering without purpose, growing increasingly desperate and potentially hostile. The regular offerings, the annual rituals, the maintained graves. These aren't just traditions, they're safety measures. Little Gang's mother maintained a small altar in their home, burning incense every morning for the family's ancestors. Little Gang used to find this superstitious when he was young, but after witnessing what happened to Nai Nai, after seeing what desperation could drive a spirit to do, he understood. The altar wasn't about superstition. It was about maintaining relationships across the boundary of death. In the years following these incidents, Little Gang developed a sensitivity to spiritual presence. Nothing dramatic, no visions, no messages from beyond, just an awareness. He could walk into a room and sense whether it held any lingering energy from past events. Old houses felt heavier than new ones. Places where people had died violently had a different quality than places where they died peacefully. His mother said this sensitivity ran in the family. Her grandmother had it too, the ability to sense when the veil was thin, when spirits were close. It wasn't a gift anyone asked for, but it was useful. It meant you knew when to be cautious, when to show respect, when to light incense and make offerings just in case. Little Gang learned to trust these instincts. When a place felt wrong, he left. When crossing unfamiliar ground at twilight, he recited protective phrases under his breath. Nothing elaborate, just simple words of respect and non-aggression. I mean no harm. I'm just passing through. Please let me pass in peace. Usually that was enough. The two stories old Auntie Goo's restless spirit and the desperate snake immortal taught Little Gang fundamental truths about the relationship between the living and the dead. The dead aren't inherently dangerous, but the dead have needs, and when those needs go unmet, desperation follows. And desperate beings, living or dead, can be dangerous, not through malice, but through sheer need. Master Liu passed away when Little Gang was in his early 20s. The old man died peacefully, in his sleep after completing his morning rituals. His funeral was enormous, half the county attended. So many people had been helped by him over the decades. So many hauntings resolved, possessions ended. Troubled spirits guided to peace. At the funeral, people told stories. Family after family stood up and described how Master Liu had helped them. The common thread in all the stories was his compassion, not just for the living, but for the dead. He never treated spirits as enemies to be destroyed. He treated them as beings in crisis, needing assistance. He taught us, one speaker said, that mercy extends beyond death, that compassion doesn't end at the boundary of the living world. He showed us that even the dead deserve dignity. The crowd murmured agreement. Master Liu's legacy wasn't just the specific spirits he'd helped, but the approach he demonstrated. a way of engaging with the supernatural that was neither fearful nor arrogant. After Master Lu's death, several of his students tried to continue his work, but they found it difficult. The mediator's role requires not just knowledge but temperament, the ability to remain calm when confronted by the impossible, to negotiate while terrified, to show respect to beings that might be hostile. Not everyone can do it. The village still occasionally experiences supernatural disturbances. Without Master Lu, they've had to find other solutions. Sometimes they bring in mediators from neighboring counties. Sometimes they attempt the rituals themselves, following the instructions in old books. Sometimes they simply endure, hoping the spirits will eventually move on. But the knowledge is fading. Fewer young people believe in spirits. Fewer still want to learn the old ways of managing supernatural relationships. The railroad tracks incident happened decades ago now. The people who witnessed it are aging, dying. Soon it will be just a story. And stories, over time, lose their power to convince. Little Gang worries about this. He has recorded his mother's testimony about Nai Nai's possession. He has written down everything he remembers about old Auntie Gu's funeral ritual. Not because he expects people to believe, but because the knowledge itself has value. Even if dismissed as superstition, it contains practical wisdom about respect for the dead, about compassion for the desperate, about maintaining boundaries while remaining open to communication. These stories survive because they're true, maybe not literally, maybe not in ways that Western empiricism would accept, but true in deeper senses. They're true to human experience of death and loss, true to the universal need for meaning and continuity, true to the way cultures develop methods for managing the psychological terror of mortality. The modern world has little patience for such stories. Science has explained so much. Medicine has conquered what once seemed supernatural. Psychology has rationalized what our ancestors called possession, and yet, my friends, there remain gaps, experiences that don't fit neatly into materialist frameworks. Little Gang, now a middle-aged man living in Shanghai, occasionally meets other people who've had similar experiences. They recognize each other somehow, a certain look in the eye, a particular wariness when the conversation turns to death and spirits. They don't advertise these experiences. They don't seek to convince skeptics. They simply know what they know. Sometimes, late at night in his apartment, Little Gang will light incense, not for any specific ancestor, but for all the forgotten dead, for spirits like the Snake Immortal, who died unmourned, for ghosts like old Auntie Gu, who linger too long in beloved places, for all the beings caught between worlds, seeking recognition, seeking peace. The smoke rises, the boundaries thin, and for a moment, standing in his high-rise apartment hundreds of miles from his village, Little Gang can almost hear the creak of a rocking chair, almost sense the sinuous movement of something ancient and persistent, not threatening, just present, reminding him that the world is wider and stranger than most people dare to admit. These two stories, Nian Kui and the Snake Spirit as Possession, represent a particular worldview. One that sees death not as termination but as transition. One that understands the supernatural not as separate from the natural but as part of a larger continuum. One that maintains that respect and compassion must extend across all boundaries, even the boundary between life and death. This worldview has practical benefits. It makes the living more careful about how they treat both the dying and the dead. It encourages regular remembrance, maintained graves, honored promises. It creates a framework where death doesn't sever all bonds, where the dead retain some agency, some voice, some ability to make demands on the living. Is this true in a scientific sense? Perhaps not, but truth has many forms. The truth of a story lies not in its literal accuracy, but in what it teaches, what it preserves, what it allows people to do and feel and understand. And these stories teach something valuable, that carelessness toward death has consequences, that every being living or dead deserves dignity, That desperation can make even gentle creatures dangerous. The rocking chair incident taught respect for the dying's attachments. The possession incident taught compassion for the desperate dead. Together they form a moral education, one that can't be captured in simple rules, but must be experienced, witnessed, felt. Little Gang's children raised in the city listen politely when he tells these stories, but he can see they don't really believe. They think grandfather is telling folk tales, amusing but not real. Perhaps that is inevitable. Each generation must find its own relationship with death, its own way of managing the terror of mortality. But he tells the stories anyway, because stories are how knowledge survives when belief fades. Because someday one of his children might face something that science can't explain, and when that moment comes, they'll remember grandfather's tales. They'll remember that there are protocols for engaging with the supernatural. They'll remember that respect and compassion work even across the boundary of death. The village where these events occurred still exists, though it is changed. The old mud brick houses have been replaced with concrete structures. The railroad has been modernized. Young people leave for cities and rarely return. The old ways are dying. The grave beside the railroad tracks remains. Someone still tends it, leaves offerings, burns incense. Perhaps it is one of Master Lu's former students. Perhaps it is someone else who knows the story. Or perhaps it is not maintained by human hands at all. Perhaps the offerings appear by themselves, materialized from nothing. The dead caring for the dead. Little Gang returns to the village once a year, during Qingming, the tomb sweeping festival when the living honor the dead. He tends his family's graves, of course, but he also stops by that small grave beside the tracks. He leaves flowers, lights incense, pours a small cup of tea onto the earth. "I remember," he says quietly to the grave. "Your story won't be forgotten, not while I live." It is a small gesture, but perhaps that is all any of us can do. Remember the desperate, honor the dead, maintain the stories that bridge worlds. As for old Auntie Goo's house, it stood empty for years after Master Ding's death. No one wanted to live there. Not because of fear, the haunting had been resolved, after all, but out of respect. Some places should remain quiet, undisturbed, memorial to what occurred there. Eventually, the house was torn down, the land sold. A new family built a modern home on the site. They know nothing of what happened there. Their children play in the courtyard where dogs once barked at an empty chair. Life continues. Memory fades. The cycle persists, but on certain nights when the moon is full and the air is still, neighbors say they sometimes hear it. Very faint, almost imperceptible. The sound of wood creaking rhythmically, back and forth, back and forth. It might be the new house settling, it might be the wind, or it might be something else. Something that remembers when memory itself has faded. These stories end, my friends, but they don't really end. They become part of the place, woven into the landscape, absorbed into the collective memory. The village beside the railroad, the crossing where spirits linger, the corner where a chair once rocked by itself. These locations hold more than just physical space. They hold history, tragedy, resolution. They hold proof that the world is stranger than we usually admit. And the people who live through these events, they carry the stories in their bodies, in sudden chills when passing certain spots, in wariness of twilight crossings, in the habit of showing respect even to empty spaces. The stories aren't just narratives, they're lived wisdom, embodied knowledge about how to navigate a world that contains more than meets the eye. So yes, the night is deep, my friends. And yes, these stories are frightening, but they're also comforting in their way. They tell us we're not alone, not in life, and not in death. They tell us there are protocols for managing fear, rituals for negotiating with the unknown. They tell us that respect and compassion are powers that work even in realms beyond our understanding. The stories survive because they serve needs deeper than entertainment. They teach the young how to approach death with dignity. They comfort the grieving by suggesting connection persists beyond mortality. They enforce social bonds by making clear that our obligations don't end when someone stops breathing. They keep the dead present in memory, preventing them from becoming hungry ghosts, seeking attention through disturbance. Little Gang understands this now. In his middle age, the stories aren't about supernatural phenomena, or rather, they're not just about that. They're about maintaining proper relationships with death, with the dead, with the sacred mystery that surrounds mortality. They're about not being so arrogant as to think we understand everything. Not being so callous as to dismiss what we don't understand. And so the stories continue, told by grandparents to grandchildren, whispered at funerals, shared among those who've witnessed the impossible, dismissed by skeptics, believed by those who've experienced their truth. Changing with each telling but maintaining their essential message: be careful, be respectful, remember the dead, honor your promises. The boundary between worlds is thinner than you think. Night falls silent once more, my friends. Outside your window, the world continues oblivious to these tales from far away, from a different culture, from a different understanding of death and spirits. But perhaps tonight you'll think twice before dismissing the creak of floorboards as merely the house settling. Perhaps you'll remember that dogs see things we cannot. Perhaps you'll show a little more respect to the empty spaces where the dead once lived. Because these stories, these tales from rural China about rocking chairs and possessed grandmothers and desperate snake spirits, they're not really about China at all. They're about universal truths. Death comes to all cultures. Loss is universal. The need for dignity transcends geography. And the desire to be remembered, to matter, to have one's suffering acknowledged, that is human, or perhaps more accurately, that is sentient. It belongs to any being capable of awareness and longing. So sleep carefully tonight, my friends. Check your doors. Look into the corners where shadows gather. And if you hear something unexplainable, a creak, a whisper, a sense of presence perhaps, don't immediately dismiss it. Perhaps pause. Listen, ask yourself, is something trying to communicate? Is some desperate being seeking help? And if so, what would Master Liu do? The answer, of course, is listen first. Approach with respect rather than fear. Offer what can be reasonably offered. Maintain boundaries, but also maintain compassion. Because in the end, whether spirits are real or simply manifestations of our collective anxiety about death, the approach Master Liu demonstrated has value. It teaches us how to face the unknown with courage and kindness. And isn't that a skill we all need? The night falls silent once more, but you know where to find me when the darkness calls again. Subscribe, my friends, so Netherwave Radio may reach you the next time the moon bleeds red. Until then, sleep carefully.